I'm going to press record. I'm going to mute myself. I don't know. I won't mute myself yet, but I will hide myself. And okay, so we are going to broadcast now. So we'll be live in 3, 2, 1.
And I think I'll just wait a couple minutes for people to come in. Kayla, you give me a wave when I should start, maybe. We're just giving everybody a few minutes to come in and get settled, and then we'll get started in about 2 minutes or less. Okay. Well, I'll get started because people can miss my little introduction here, but while we get started with the protocols, but good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us on a sunny afternoon and Thursday. My name's Becky Davison, and I'm the Vice President of the Halifax Chamber of Commerce, so happy to be here. And it's our pleasure to welcome you to our Navigating COVID-19 webinar series with our special guests from the public relations firm National, who's a good partner with us. So we're happy to have them both here. In the midst of a pandemic, our business communication strategies have changed significantly. I'm looking forward to hearing from our guests today on some strategic guidance on how to communicate with our audiences and how to effectively engage them and what we should be thinking about as we move towards reopening. So exciting announcement made yesterday. Exciting and maybe heart pounding as we get back to regular business for some industries. So we're paying close attention to that. We are going to have a question and answer period. So we do have a question and answer box. So please feel free to put your questions and answers throughout there, and we'll moderate that throughout. If you'd like to leave a comment, we also have the chat box. So I would encourage you all to address your messages to panelists and all attendees, because we all, everyone probably wants to see what you have to say. We don't want to keep anything behind. And if there's something that you want to address with just the panelists, you can just say all panelists. So, and we can see that on our side too. So I'd like to introduce our guests for today. So we have Kristie Forbes, who is a senior consultant with National. She's a marketing professional with both agency and corporate marketing experience across various industries. She has worked for brands including McDonald's Canada, Nestle Canada, GlaxoSmithKline, Eastlink, NSLC, and the IWK Foundation. So welcome, Kristie. Thanks for being here today. And now Jill Hartlen is also a senior consultant with National. Jill has been advising clients on smart, creative strategies in Canada and abroad for over 10 years. With a unique blend of experience across healthcare, consumer, business, and government sectors, she has a passion for translating complex subjects into impactful stories that resonate with audiences. So I really appreciate you both for joining us, and I know our members do too. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Becky, for the very kind introduction. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on what is a very beautiful day and a warm day in Halifax. So we're really, really thrilled to be here talking content with you all. I think I'm sure there were other things competing for your attention today as we all work from home. So really hoping that we'll bring some value as you hear some of our thoughts and considerations on content strategy. So we can dive right in here.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So thanks, Jill, and thank you, Becky, for having us. So, where are we today? We are past crisis. We're now talking about recovery, and we now have a reopening date in Nova Scotia. So really exciting. And we're in what a lot of people are calling the dance, and that's a period where we're out of total lockdown, but there are still a level of restrictions in place. And because I love a good metaphor, I'll run with it. We know that in this dance, there's going to be forward steps and backward steps, and we will be stepping on people's toes. And we know that that's going to happen, and it's going to be a little messy. But there are ways that you can be prepared. There are things that you can start thinking about now, questions that you can ask yourself. And that's what we're hoping to start, is that kind of conversation today, and get you thinking about those things that can get you prepared for what's coming next. And we know Sarah Young, the managing partner from National, used this quote in a meeting the other day, and I've been thinking about it ever since. And it's that we are all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. So this is going to look very different for every organization, for every person. But there are principles that will apply to all that we want to reinforce today, and just start thinking about how this could apply to your organization. So we'll start with some broader principles, and we will drill down into some specific examples that you can activate tomorrow. So let's start with a basic one, and that is, what is content marketing? And I think it is a bit of a buzzword. It has been for some time now, and it means a little something different to everyone in the marketing space. But really, it's this definition talking about content marketing as a strategic marketing approach focused on creating and distributing valuable, relevant, and consistent content to attract and retain a clearly defined audience, and ultimately drive profitable customer action. And so really, it's about sharing information that's relevant to your audience. It's about showing up in a relevant way across all of your channels. A more visual way, and one of my favorite ways to explain content marketing, is if you have what your brand cares about over here and what your audience cares about over there, then somewhere in the middle is that sweet spot for the kind of content you should be thinking about creating. What's interesting now is that there is a lot of focus on the pandemic that we're in. And so there is a lot of similar alignment between what your audience cares about and what your brand cares about right now. But it is really thinking about where you can kind of nail that sweet spot in between those two things. And over to Jill.
Perfect. So when we think, great kind of setting the table all on the same page around what is content strategy, and there's no doubt that it is more important than ever, perhaps. Right now, a lot more people are online for a longer amount of time. They're looking for information, they're looking for distraction and entertainment. So when we think about that, really important, where should we start? And that leads us to somewhere that we always like to start. Particularly at National, we're very big on kind of insights-driven strategy. So we always like to look at the research and ground ourselves there. So the good news here is it's a perfect time to conduct research, whether that's something formal or whether it's incredibly informal. There are a lot of sort of free resources. People are wondering what's everyone thinking, and because times have changed so drastically, and so quickly, there's a lot of people are paying attention to, what is the emotional state of the country and the province? What are brands thinking? What are consumers thinking about? And, where are they mentally right now? And what are they looking for? What do they need? So there's a great sort of free library right now. If you're probably tuning into webinars, obviously like this one and others that are sharing that kind of content, which is a really great place to start. And even just having a browse around looking for some of those insights at a brand and organization or industry level is a really, really important way to start. We also know that from a research perspective, we're actually seeing, if you are looking to kind of conduct more formal research, and that's within your means and your budget, it's a great time to do so, because there's been something around a 10% uptake in kind of online surveys and things like that. So if you ever were thinking of a time to do your research, it's a good time, because people are obviously having a little bit more potentially free time on their hands to engage in things like that. So if we move on to kind of, once we have our research in place, or we have some form of insights that we're able to rely on, whether formal or even just putting a post out on your social channels and asking your audiences what they're looking for or what's on their minds, it's time to revisit your playbook. And that's all about your content strategy. So ideally you have one of these and you can look at it and reference it, because we began this journey at a, sort of a bit of a scary, very unprecedented, as you've heard many times, era where, everyone kind of, and our counsel to a lot of clients, and our perspective was, halt the content strategy. Nothing right now is quite as relevant as the coronavirus and you know, the updates and the evolution of that situation. It's a very serious matter. Obviously, it is still an incredibly serious matter, but to our discussion at the beginning, we're starting to see an easing of restrictions. People are looking forward to kind of this very much a next phase of reopening cautiously and with some worry. But it's time where we can kind of look back at our content strategy and say, okay, where are we now? And what parts of this content strategy may be salvageable, may be still relevant? And where do we need to kind of augment that with some new content? And it's really all about a balance. But there are ways that you can kind of make your, what we call evergreen content, being, those are the things, those are how-to videos, that's content that will always be relevant and up to date and isn't going to look old or outdated. How can we kind of bring back some of that evergreen content with perhaps some more practical ways, like a different lead-in, or, you know, a quick update of an end slate at the end of a video or something like that, just to reflect, yes, this is current, this is relevant. So yeah, that's where you should always start, is your strategy.
And so when we think about, oh, a little bit of feedback there. Okay, we're good. So when we think about what we should be saying, we recognize that the type of content for that people are looking for has changed. It changed when the pandemic began, and it's changed since. And so it's really important to be in tune with how your audience is how their morale is changing throughout this process, what they're looking for is changing throughout this process. And I found this really interesting chart from the New York Times that reflects what people were searching for, what kind of content they were consuming during different points in the pandemic. And so you can see that in the beginning of the pandemic in March, people were scared. They didn't know what was happening. They were just searching for information. They wanted to know what was happening locally and across the world. And at that point at National, you know, we were supporting brands to make sure any of their content that was planned was sensitive to the severity of the situation or was offering a helpful perspective. And we're still in a lot of ways doing just that. But things have changed since then. And really, you know, at this point in the process, there was zero tolerance for brands trying to make light of the situation or talking about anything that wasn't really COVID related. But then as time went on, people were looking for context. They were looking to sense makers to give them a way to understand what was happening. So you saw opinion articles you know, went up in popularity. And then as people were growing weary of lockdown and becoming more concerned about how long this is really going to go on, they're starting to think about, how can I live through this? We saw a big spike in wellness and food content. And then in late April, they saw a big uptake in sports and art, showing that people had turned a bit of a corner. They were looking for optimistic and distracting content. And while we're not seeing May results here, I would hazard a guess from seeing other research that people are optimistic, but they're also cautious and anxious about the return. And so they'll be looking for information around reopening, looking for information about how they can start regaining their freedom while still maintaining a sense of safety. And so I think it will be really interesting to see how we can create content that speaks to the evolving need states of our audience. And that, you know, that was always something that was challenging, but it's particularly challenging now as it is evolving so quickly. So when we think about how we communicate, it's really important to think about consistency and clarity. And so I mentioned, you know, when I say we're out of crisis, what I really mean is we're out of that initial shock and it, you know, the needing that quick reaction. We're now in something, we've been in this for some time. We are going into a different phase though, where there will be confusion around what is open, what isn't, what is your new experience, how will it be different than it was before? And I think it's really important to take this opportunity to do an audit of all your channels, make sure that you're communicating across your website, your email, your social channels, and be thinking in the same way that we responded so quickly at the beginning of the pandemic to, to update all of those channels and be communicating clearly. It's even more important as you begin to reopen. And so a really good example was, just the other day, I was looking to go to a restaurant close to where I'm living, and their website didn't even have anything about their COVID response. And so then I just assumed that maybe they went under, maybe they're closed and they won't be reopening. And then I went to their Instagram, and they had a daily menu that they were posting for takeout. And I thought, if I had just stopped that journey after checking their website, then they never would have gotten my business. So maybe you're a restaurant, maybe you're professional services, and it's going to look a little different for you, but the same principle applies, in that you need to make sure that all of your channels are singing from the same soundbook. And really, particularly as each province is rolling out at different times, every industry in every province is rolling out at different times. And then businesses within each industry, within each province, is probably going to be reopening their doors at different times. It's just that much more important that you're consistent and clear across channels. So here's a really interesting example, one that you've probably seen often in terms of consistency and clarity, is the Nova Scotia government. So, I think they've been doing an excellent job in communicating across all of their channels consistently. They're following up with visuals. They're doing the best they can in a very rapidly evolving situation. And it's through live streams, it's through visuals. They're presenting content in a lot of different ways, but they're doing so consistently and clearly. And when you're talking about safety and regulations that are changing day by day, it's been it's been a big challenge for them, but I think that they've been doing a really great job in doing that across all channels.
Absolutely. And I think, a potential reaction here is, yes, obviously the Nova Scotia government has a very natural sort of role and responsibility and kind of an accountability, obviously, to be a true leader. And they're talking about, policy and guidelines, something that everyone is paying attention to. They're sort of the authority. So, this is quite a natural extension of, like a content strategy for the Nova Scotia government, and they have a real voice here that everyone is listening to. But the next slide here shows just sort of an example on the other end of the spectrum, which is just from a clothing brand called Reformation. They are a sort of, a lovely fashion brand for women, but the majority of their clothes are definitely, dresses that certainly I would never work from home in. I can imagine that sort of their purchases and consumers aren't necessarily thinking about the types of clothing and garments that they're selling, and that their kind of brand loyalists would typically be looking for. So just to show how they were able to stay relevant despite quite a clear contrast in the type of content that people are necessarily looking for in this time. Is, just a few examples here. So one of the big pillars of their content strategy and their brand is sustainability. So everything is sustainably produced. So here they were able to kind of leverage a little bit of conversation around the average kind of users and their sustainability from how much drain on like electricity and brick and mortar versus working from home. And when you're surfing the website on work from home versus going into brick and mortar, what does that look like from an energy consumption pattern? They've also layered that in with a really nice trend that we're seeing in content right now, which is kind of leveraging a bit of nostalgia. So let's face it, our lives might be a little bit less exciting than they were perhaps before, quarantine and lockdown and self-isolation and the pandemic hit. So people are really looking for, past experiences, a little bit of nostalgia to kind of remind us of all of those wonderful memories. And so, leveraging kind of that 90s sitcom image there with Rachel on the phone when we're talking about working from home was just a nice tie-in for them. We also really like this example because up in the top corner, it's sort of hard to see the exact text, but essentially when everyone came out with, quite formal, very serious, to our point earlier around that initial phase of the pandemic, what are you doing? Are you acknowledging this situation? A lot of uncertainty. it was a really nice tone that they were able to strike, and no doubt Reformation would have a very sophisticated and very sound kind of content strategy where their brand voice and tone would be very clearly outlined, and they were able to strike, again, that very nice balance of what is the content we're talking about. Yes, it's serious. Yes, it's unknown. We're talking about the fact that we're shutting down our stores and we're unable to service customers, but we're doing it with a little bit of a very casual tone. So it's, the line starts out, guys, by now we're all aware of the severity of COVID-19 and probably exhausted from the anxiety of it all. So this is a little bit of a different language than kind of that very common, these are unprecedented times and we want to provide a formal update on our monitoring and policy adjustments, like that kind of a language that would be different based on the organization that you're doing a content strategy for. The other way, they're still sharing pictures of dresses that probably not many people are working from a silk dress at home, but they're just layering that in with some light content. It's nice outside, or at least it looks that way from all the windows and weather apps. So again, kind of a nod to this. It very much is, to Kristie's point earlier, although we are in different boats and we're all experiencing this differently, it's kind of this really, in a way, interesting collective global experience that we're having, and it does look a little bit different, but all of a sudden, content that a local business in New York is pumping out is very relevant to me here in Nova Scotia from my living room, because we are having somewhat of a shared collective experience. So it gives your content that much more kind of legs and relevance to a wide kind of range of audience. We go on to the next slide there. Kristie, can you flip to the next slide? Okay. Are we? Hi.
Sorry, guys. 1 second here.
Perfect.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Perfect. No, it's no problem. So thinking about these spotlights, if we move on to the next slide there. So if we're thinking about kind of the table stakes, it's consistency and it's clarity. But then let's go a little bit deeper and let's think about maybe elevating from there a bit and going into kind of how can we surprise and delight people? We know they're at home. And again, the most important, the table stakes is that consistency, that clarity of information that they're seeking. But, let's do a little bit of something extra for those who are there for the entertainment, for the distraction of it all, which we know from research that a lot of people are finding that outlet in social media and content and on the internet and through other media. So a couple of examples, if we move on to the next slide here. One is, and these are things that just, they're going to get your brand a little bit of extra love. And one thing we certainly know at National is crises can be very, very difficult situations to manage, and they can certainly have very negative impacts on organizations, but they're also a really critical point in time that you can emerge from as a brand, as an organization, stronger. So they give you an opportunity to show up when people are really paying attention. So just as a nice, very lighthearted example, DoubleTree by Hilton, obviously travel plans, certainly organizations involved in the travel industry are not having a great time right now, or at least hadn't been, but Hilton, a hotel which people probably stopped paying very much attention to what they were up to. They have this really famous cookie recipe. I don't know if anyone is familiar, but they're chocolate chip cookies that they apparently serve guests. Are delicious, and for the first time ever they released this chocolate chip cookie recipe to the world, and it got them very simple thing, but quite a nice bring a smile gesture that they were able to do, and it got them they really leveraged that in their content strategy on all of their channels, on their social media, on their website, and then even further, they were actually able to earn some significant traditional media coverage through the Washington Post, and just really get a nice nod for their brand and create some smiles. So we think about how can we make people smile. People are here for human connection, so it certainly can be, as we're taken out of our workplaces and perhaps our normal routine, our coffee shops that we would frequent, we are looking for human connection in these times of, relevant isolation. So how can we do that? We really want to think about community. Community is key right now. And that can mean a lot of different things in a content strategy. But there's no doubt that there's this sort of general rallying cry around buying local, around kind of feeling that and maintaining that sense of maybe lost connection to your community where you're living and what is immediately outside of kind of the four walls that you've gotten used to. So one thing we've seen from research is that while people's spending overall intentions are down and their spending is down, they are significantly putting more of a focus on buying local, supporting local, which is no surprise given the hardships that many businesses are facing. So it's just a note to really think about some creative partnerships. Think about, maybe it's just proximity that relates you to someone in another business in your community, but is there something creative and different you can do online, on social media, or develop some piece of content that kind of shouts out the other person? And I would say, don't just think about local businesses in the traditional sense of the word. You may be a national or multinational corporation with a local office, and that still very much is seen as local and can play a real part in community for people right now online.
Yeah, and to build on that, I think during my time at McDonald Canada, we would see that with our owner operators. And so, when you think of large companies, McDonald's Canada, McDonald's Global would certainly be probably among the first that you might think of. And they always emphasize the role that the individual restaurant owner operators had within the community. And so they really emphasized whether it was supporting local charities, it was attending local events, it was ingraining themselves in the community. That was just as important as participating in the overall corporate marketing initiative. So certainly something that we feel, whether or not you are that local business in the traditional sense, or if you're a branch, there's certainly ways that you can still connect yourself to your local community. And more than ever, you really shouldn't be afraid to create. It's a really interesting time for content creation. And the pressures of production quality have certainly lessened. And we talked about consistency and clarity before, and we don't think that those need to come at the expense of creativity. And one of my favorite examples, Tiger King seems like irrelevant now. It was so big early on, but their follow-up episode after it was aired was essentially a Zoom call. And we've seen lots of other content creators just getting creative with how they're bringing things to life. And so while you may have had reservations in the past about creating content around, do I have the budget to do this well? And I think now is just a really interesting time to get your feet wet and try some things out, whether it's using Facebook Live, webinars, just having a Q&A session. There's lots that you can do, and don't be afraid to try things. And right now we're talking a lot about TikTok, and TikTok is a really interesting platform because, just like Instagram and Facebook seemed like this authentic, raw place for brands to create content not too long ago, TikTok has now kind of entered that space, and everyone's trying to figure out how to do that well from a marketing perspective. But it's really about, thinking about your message, thinking about what people are looking for, and creating content to suit that. And I think it's also important to think about leveraging past content and thinking about nostalgia and, what have you done well in the past that you might be able to repurpose for today, knowing that you need to put it through the filter of what is relevant and, what is sensitive to the situation and severity of the situation that we're in, but what could actually work today that would have worked yesterday as well.
Absolutely. And when you do, just to kind of layer in there, when you do something and you create some content, don't be afraid to really maximize that. So a lot of times, when we're advising on content strategies, it seems like, everything needs to be new and fresh and different. And, make sure that webinar you've done or that beautiful piece of content, you've created can be shared on a number of channels at a number of different times, while oftentimes to you, especially after developing these things and you're so in the midst of it, it can seem quite repetitive. There's some science to suggest that, you know, you need 7 different contact points with the same information to audiences to really let that stick. So that's really important for sure.
So a really good example here is one of our the clients that we're working with now is New Brunswick Tourism, and this is just one small piece of a very large campaign, but we're calling it New Brunswick NBTV Live from New Brunswick. And what they've done is they've reached out to their owner operators or their tourism operators, and they've sourced that partnership to create a series of content videos. And so, you know, something as simple as having the Huntsman Marine Fundy Discovery Aquarium come out and feed the harbor seals got 12,000 views. And it was, you know, shot from someone's iPhone. It was, you know, interesting to have the expertise of the staff members and learning a little bit about the seals. But it was a moment where, you know, production quality was absolutely good enough. But it was interesting and relevant, and a lot of people really appreciated that. And so they have, you know, these types of planned content throughout the next period, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that works. And I think that it, you know, as you're thinking about how do I create all this content myself, coming back to Jill's point about partnerships and connections. How can you leverage, whether it's your audience and thinking about user-generated content or thinking about strategic partnerships? There's lots of ways to fill that content funnel. And of course, how do we make sure that your audience has a chance to see it? And Jill touched on this. It's always important to think about distribution. And that can mean a lot of different things. It can mean your owned channels, which would be your website, it would be email, it would be your own social channels. It could be earned, which could mean media coverage, pitching to media. It could be organic influencer relationships. And then of course there's paid, where you can pay to make sure that the right people are seeing it at the right time. There's lots of different ways of going about that. And, you know, at National, we like to think kind of past the traditional way of thinking about online distribution. And we like to think of, okay, well, you know, who are the right people or organizations to get this in front of? How can we take it that much further than just the typical checklist of where this needs to go? And to Jill's point, share it again. So maybe you've created a blog post and, you know, you shared it across your channels a few weeks ago. Maybe it has new relevance today. We know that not everyone saw it the first time you posted it. It's important to keep things fresh, maybe sharing a bit of a different perspective the next time you share it. But you certainly want to get the most out of the content that you're creating. So don't be afraid to share again. And of course, amplification. So alluding to that paid piece, where if you are putting an investment behind creating content, it is important to consider what the appropriate investment would be against amplifying that. And that can go a long way in making sure that you're getting the right ROI for the content that you're creating.
Perfect. And again, with that sort of amplification and, you know, share, reshare, we like to think that that's another step in the process where going back to that playbook, ideally if you have one, or now being a really great time to stop and create one. So we've talked a lot about content strategy and, you know, it's such a big topic that it would be sort of impossible to cover everything today relating to a full-blown content strategy. But what we would hope is that it's actually a great time to pause and use this kind of collective pause that many elements of our society are having and actually really think about that. So we have started to, you know, whether it's in our professional lives, working from home, you know, lines are certainly blurring, and there's a resurgence of sort of very genuine, very raw content out there, which is great. And it's just a great time to kind of think back and, you know, is now a great time to invest in really setting a table and figuring out what will work for your brand or your organization. So if there are just kind of a few things that we would love to leave you with in terms of the formal portion of the presentation, some key takeaways. One is listening to your audience. So again, great time to either leverage the kind of abundance of research that's being conducted and shared right now across industries and organizations, or to conduct your own. Revisiting your playbook, if you have one. If you don't, take a bit of time now and just give some thoughtful time to what is your content strategy? What are you sharing on each of your channels? Know and recognize that people are looking for different content, and sort of alluding to that very genuine, a little bit more raw content, and a little bit different than maybe what they're used to seeing from your brand. This has been certainly an experience for everyone, and we have adjusted to things and gotten used to things that we didn't think possible. There's been so many surprises that it's sort of quite a fluid time, and you know, if you're looking to try something out coming from your brand, now might be a great time for that via your content strategy. Being consistent and clear, particularly as we enter this new phase of reopening, is going to be really important, as Kristie mentioned. But don't focus so much on that you miss the opportunity to kind of delight your community who's listening now more than ever. We also want to think about community. Everything comes back to community, whether it's sharing you know, a social media push or some content that someone else in your community has, or thinking of new partnerships that you could forge. Now is a great time to call someone up or have a virtual coffee and talk about ways to connect. Because there's a little bit of a pause again in our sort of everydays. Don't be afraid to create. Don't let kind of perfect stand in the way from a production perspective of good to get something out there and engage your audience again with something that's maybe a little bit more raw and unfiltered. People like that right now. If you've never done a webinar, if you've never done a live Q&A or an HGTV video on your Instagram, don't be afraid to do it now. There's lots of people who are looking to tune in. And then finally, once you do create something, or as you are creating something, make the most of it and make sure that you're sharing that, you're distributing that, and you're putting, you know, as much or more thought into how this thing is going to get out there into the world and into people's homes and screens than you are making the actual thing. So hopefully those are quite a few takeaways, but hopefully it's a little bit of an outline in terms of steps to consider, things to consider as you are thinking about content right now.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jill and Kristie, both for that information. I was madly taking notes, and you've inspired me because we were in the midst of, we were doing a RFP for our marketing campaign at the time of this COVID hitting, so that was put on hold. So we've got lots of time for question and answers, and really appreciate your insights. So we've got one already. We have a few that from our neck of the woods, and we also have some coming in. So we'll start here, and I love this question already. So any suggestions on how to develop helpful and relevant content when you know your audience has conflicting needs and challenges? So how can we establish a tone that doesn't offend half the audience? And I think that's a really relevant question. There are some businesses that are thriving right now, and there are some that are not. So yeah, I'll just leave that with you guys.
I think I can jump in first and then pass it over to Kristie. I think it's a really good question, and it's very valid because it's a very tricky balance. Even within, you know, if you have a certain segment of brand loyalists and people following you, we'll all know just from talking to family members and friends and those in our circle, feelings change every day, and people feel very differently about the collective situation that we're in. So it's a good point. I would say the first place, again, that I would start, and as we mentioned, starting there at the beginning, is research. So again, and that might just be being quite frank and open with your audience, if that's a brand tone or organization that you could, or a sort of a position you could take on, whether it's your channels. So maybe just acknowledging that and being open about that to start, and saying, you know, we know that people are feeling differently about this audience. We're sharing, I've seen a lot of sort of organizations and brands do this, is we're going to be talking about these things here. You know, let us know if you're looking for something different, and then at least you're sort of positioning yourself as open to feedback, and you're listening, and people's feelings are valid. I think that's the most important thing to communicate, is that just acknowledging there's going to be a wide range of reactions. I would say if you ever are trying to make everyone who follows you happy. It's probably never going to happen, but acknowledging that this can be a polarizing topic and there are a wide range of viewpoints, but being casual enough to say, you know, we've been talking and thinking a lot about this. We know your minds are elsewhere and it's a serious time. I think there's a level of sort of respect that needs to be given to the gravity of the situation, but acknowledging that upfront gives you a little bit more room to play.
Yeah, and I would just tag on to that. I think that's bang on, Jill. And you know, what we talk a lot about at National is your brand's narrative. And I think that as you get into those kind of sticky situations, it's really important to look at your brand DNA, look at who you are, what you stand for, your values, and start putting your response through those filters, because it you know, it may help that decision become more clear as to what you should be saying and how you should be saying it if you have very clear brand pillars and a very clear brand narrative.
That's great. So we have one of our own questions here that, and I will remind people, please feel free to use the question and answer box. This is awesome. You guys are giving us great content for us, and as the marketing person at the Chamber, this is really valuable. I'm really excited. So question on this is there such a thing as too much communication with our audiences right now?
I can take that one. I think, you know, it's kind of the classic response, it depends. But, you know, we would have seen, it depends on what your audience is looking for from you, what information that you need to communicate is. You should always be asking yourself, is this relevant? Does this need to come from me? You know, we saw early on, everyone kind of had the Cracker Barrel joke where that flood of emails came in from the CEOs talking about these unprecedented times, and they came from everyone. And, you know, by the time that Cracker Barrel responded with their point of view, everyone was kind of saying, why do I need an update from you right now? And so I think it's important to not communicate just for the sake of communicating, but to be thinking about what it is that you're putting out there. Does it add value? Is it relevant for the audience? And put it through those filters.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't say that there's, sorry, Jill, I'll just finish and say, I can't say that there's a magic number for how often you should be communicating, and it really does depend on your brand and the information you're trying to convey.
Absolutely. The other thing to mention is that, you know, when we're thinking about a content strategy, ideally, you know, to Kristie's point, there's never a magic number, and it is always a bit of a it depends kind of situation. But if you have a solid playbook, a solid content strategy in place, one of the really key components of that is going to be a channel strategy and channel consideration. So it also depends, you know, when we talk about Cracker Barrel, and they became unfortunately a little bit infamous because they came in just at that time where every single, you know, organization you ever allowed to contact you came at the same time saying roughly the same thing. This is unprecedented, and we have, you know, bought lots of Lysol and we're going to figure out what to do next. And it was all very formal. And, you know, people really push back because that's not a channel that they're coming to for all of this frivolous information. That's your email. This is, you know, reserved for quite sort of critical updates and very relevant updates. You know, you may have a content strategy that says, but our social channels, on the other hand, we know people are coming there for distraction or for entertainment right now. So really, I would say, and echo Kristie, less around kind of the quantity, is this too much, and more around the quality of, is this content relevant for someone, and are they receiving it in the right channel? So it's as much about where as it is how much, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Mary Jane just added a comment, which I appreciate. It's important to make sure the information that we're providing has meaning and is relevant to your organization. And I like this part, avoid generic messages, just as exactly what you guys were just saying. So I like this question as well. Great questions coming in, you guys. Keep it up, keep it coming. So for those of us in sales, and I think we're all in sales, needing to generate revenue, 100%, how do we strike the right tone, understanding a lot of people are currently managing difficult financial situations? So we battled with that internally at the Chamber too. Like, do we keep trying to sell right now or not? So I'll leave it to you professionals.
think it's a really good question, and something that we also have kind of grappled with it on behalf of clients and things like that. I think that the most important part is that you are considering it and it's top of mind. So that right there is going to sort of indicate there's going to be a level of nuancing and consideration that any communications should have. You know, it's a tough one. There's no doubt that you want to continue your business, obviously, but there is a real risk right now of alienating people who are sort of grappling with financial challenges, and that's the last thing they want to see. I would say, you know, again, kind of acknowledging that in a nuanced way could help you, but it is, to be honest, a really, really tricky situation. I'm not sure if you have anything specific to add, Kristie.
Yeah, I think, you know, when it comes to tone, I think we've been saying from the beginning, there isn't a lot of room for the hard sell right now. And I think that you have to be really, really careful about walking that line. At the same time, you know, we appreciate that a lot of businesses are in survival mode. And so it's a really fine balance that you need to strike. And, you know, what we've been talking to clients about is about figuring out how you can be helpful and how you can, you know, focus the conversation around the ways that you can add value for your customers. And, you know, I heard a webinar the other day that was really interesting, and it's a little philosophical, but talking about this pendulum that swings in society between a sense of safety and a sense of freedom. And it, you know, one does come at the expense of the other. And since the pandemic started, we certainly swung towards, you know, giving up our freedom in order to have a sense of security and safety. And so as people are still focusing on maintaining safety, but are looking to regain some of that freedom, I think it's also interesting to think about how can you as an organization help deliver on either of those two things. So how in this time can you help them be more safe, feel more safe, or how can you help them feel as if they're regaining freedom? What is it about your products or your services that can liberate them or protect them? So just really interesting to think about where you can play in that space versus you know, going directly for the hard sell, because it is a challenging time to do that for sure.
Definitely. And one note on that is, you know, you really, although we're passing everything through the lens of COVID-19 and coronavirus, to Kristie's point, the hard sell, really our guidance would be to completely veer away from that. Even in terms of, if there's a reason why your product is extra relevant right now because of COVID-19, it's still important to soften that. I think everyone from sort of media to consumers and everyone in between really does have their senses a little bit heightened around, are you being opportunistic right now? Are you self-promoting? And it's not tasteful. So it's sort of really important to kind of err on that side of the softer sell and the focus on adding value, as Kristie said.
Great. Thank you. I've got 2 more questions here. So from the lens of a nonprofit, how would you balance content between emerging optimism of the public with the persisting need for donation that COVID has caused? And we have close to 300 not-for-profit members as part of the chamber. So certainly a big risk for them right now is how do they get back to where they were. And yeah, I'll see if you guys have an answer for that.
Yeah, I can start, Jill. I'm sure you might have something to add to this, but you know, I think that we are seeing an uptake in charitable donations in terms of people looking for ways to be helpful and, you know, sitting at home feeling like they can't solve the problems of the pandemic themselves, but what can they do instead? So there is certainly an appetite for the not-for-profit and the charitable organizations and helping them get through this. And so, you know, I think for a charitable organization, there's lots that you can be saying right now, and there's lots of people who are looking to do something to feel like they're making a difference. I think that it's also leaning into your local impact, and I think people do have a little bit more room and a little bit more of an interest in supporting those those organizations, because they know that they're in a challenging spot right now. So I think there's, you know, people are rooting for those organizations, and it's okay to lean into that.
Yeah, I would say for sure, to echo that, people really are looking, they're feeling helpless right now, and it's a horrible situation. There are so many, you know, non-for-profits and community organizations that need help, to your point, more than ever. You know, we work with a lot of them, and I would suggest it's going back to that, how can you be showing up a little differently maybe? Because the other thing is, because there's such a rallying cry around community and needs right now, it is a little tougher to break through the clutter. So there are, you know, more corporate foundations that are coming up with a lot of messaging around the ways that they're giving to certain causes. And there are a lot of grassroots social initiatives going on. So I would say, you know, can you lean into any new partnerships? Can you show up in a new way, even a simple, really grassroots way within the community to get some traction and really kind of coming in on that local level of impact is what is, I think, most important. Again, veering away from any of that mass messaging, community needs, you know, it's like, what are you doing? How is that story coming to life? And how can you inject a bit of a personal storytelling component to what your cause or your organization is focused on?
Yeah, I know Canteen did a really great job of shifting gears and helping out and making meals for less fortunate there. They did a great job.
Yeah, that was fantastic.
Yeah, we're coming close to the end, but I did have one more note here, and I actually wanted to talk to Kristie. But Jill, you kind of mentioned that there might be a library of resources or research available that we might have access to. Is there a way that we can all get our hands on it?
Yeah, for sure. So we've been following kind of a few organizations who are doing kind of regular reports, whether that's on sort of the emotional state of the country. I don't know what the best way to do it, Becky. Perhaps I could follow up with just, you know, several of the resources that we're staying in tune with. There's a number of organizations kind of certainly across the country that are releasing regular reports. And it is really interesting, again, particularly on sort of the mindsets and the mentality of consumers in the public right now, what they're thinking about. One of the key insights this week was really, although we are looking forward with, you know, optimism and a little bit of excitement for what's next and seeing a little bit of normalcy return, in Nova Scotia, we are very much a little concerned about that, to be honest. We're one of the later provinces to see the virus come in play. So there's still that lingering, are you sure we're here yet, coming from us, is what the research is telling us.
Yeah, we also email our attendees at these webinars. So Jill, if you want to share that with myself and Kayla, we can share that to everyone. And Kristie, you mentioned, I was very curious about the safety versus freedom pendulum. I'd love to read more about that, because I feel we're on a balance with that every day. Even just, we're reopening our offices on Monday with a small group of people, and there are a few people that are just gung-ho to get back there, and maybe blindly optimistic, and some people that are afraid, and that's fine, and we have to find that balance, right? So I'd love to read more on that.
Absolutely.
It's 2:53, so we're almost out of time, but you guys, this was amazing. I'm so glad I got to host this one. So I haven't hosted in a while, and I really appreciate your insights. Like, I took 3 pages of notes, and I'll probably follow up with you. So this is great content. We do have a ton of small businesses as part of the chamber. I'm sure they got a lot out of that. So we really appreciate your time. I think this, now Kayla can correct me, but this is probably number 70 of webinars that we've been doing since March 16th. So I like what you talk about. People are lenient, so don't be afraid. So we jumped in and became experts in Zoom. So people are very forgiving right now. So it's true. We should all do that. So all of our webinars are on our website, halifaxchamber.com. This webinar was recorded, so you can share it with your marketing team and your PR team, even if that's just one other person in your office. And I really thank everyone for joining us today. So thank you both, Kristie and Jill. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.